"She'll come back," Daniel Brooks said with a lazy confidence, swirling the last inch of whiskey in his glass as laughter rippled around him, the low hum of the bar wrapping his words in approval, as if the world itself agreed with him, as if women like Emily Carter always circled back, always returned to the man who had once defined them, and for a moment under the warm amber lights and the polished oak bar it felt true, because the version of Emily he remembered would have come back, quiet and apologetic, eyes searching for his approval, hands folded neatly in her lap like she was waiting to be chosen again. But that version of her no longer existed, even if he didn't know it yet, even if he was about to find out in the most public, irreversible way possible, because right then, as the door to the bar opened and a slice of cool evening air slipped inside, Emily Carter stepped in, and everything Daniel thought he knew shifted just slightly out of place. Not enough to alarm him. Not yet, but enough to unsettle something deep in his chest that he quickly dismissed, because at first glance, she looked exactly the same: simple navy dress, low heels, no designer labels, no statement jewelry, just the same understated woman he had once grown tired of, the same woman he had walked away from without looking back, and he smiled, slow and satisfied, as if the universe had just confirmed his belief. "Emily," he called out, his voice cutting through the room with practiced ease. And she turned, her movement unhurried, her expression composed in a way that didn't quite match the memory he held of her, because there was no flicker of surprise, no visible sting, just a calm acknowledgement as her eyes met his across the room, and for a brief second, something in that gaze made his smile falter, but he recovered quickly, pushing off the bar and walking toward her with the same effortless confidence that had once charmed her, that had once convinced her to build a life around him. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, looking her over in a way that felt more like assessment than curiosity, his eyes lingering just long enough to suggest familiarity, ownership, something he had never quite let go of even after the divorce papers were signed. "Still in town?" he added, his tone light, almost amused, and she nodded once, a small, polite gesture that gave him nothing, no invitation, no vulnerability to latch onto, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because he had expected something else, a reaction, a crack, a sign that he still mattered. "I heard you were working at that bookstore on Maple," he continued, tilting his head slightly, the hint of a smirk forming. "That suits you." The word landed with a softness that disguised its edge, the kind of backhanded compliment he had perfected over the years, the kind that used to make her shrink, used to make her question herself, and for a moment, the noise of the bar seemed to fade, the clinking glasses, the distant laughter, all of it dimming as he waited for her to respond, to fall into the rhythm he had set for so long, but Emily only held his gaze, steady and unreadable, and something in the stillness of that moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for doubt to flicker across his mind before he pushed it away, because in his world, nothing had changed, not really. She was still the woman he had left behind, still the one who had built her life around him and lost it when he walked away, still the one who should have been broken, still the one who should have been waiting, and yet, as she finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm, there was no trace of the past in it, no hesitation, no lingering ache, just a calm certainty that didn't fit the story he had told himself. "I'm doing just fine, Daniel," she said, and it wasn't the words that caught him off guard, it was the way she said them, like she didn't need him to believe it, like she didn't need him at all. And for the first time that night, as the room seemed to come back into focus around them, Daniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not regret, not yet, but something close to it, something that whispered, quietly and persistently, that he might have misjudged the ending of a story he thought he had already finished. Daniel should have walked away after that moment, should have returned to his drink and his easy certainty. But something about Emily Carter refused to let him settle back into the version of reality he preferred, because she did not linger, did not try to extend the conversation or prove anything. She simply gave a small nod and stepped past him, her presence brushing the air like a quiet shift in temperature, and for a second, he stood there, watching her move toward the door with a composure that did not match the woman he remembered, the woman who used to hesitate, who used to look back, who used to wait for him to say something that would decide her next move. But this Emily did not pause, and that absence of hesitation followed him long after she left, threading itself through the rest of his evening in a way he could not quite ignore, even as his friends continued talking, even as the music swelled and glasses clinked around him, because every time he replayed the encounter in his mind, it did not fit, it did not align with the narrative he had built so carefully since the divorce. The one where he was the one who moved forward while she remained stuck in the past. And that quiet contradiction unsettled him more than any argument ever could. And over the next few days it only grew, subtle at first, like a detail just out of focus, until it began to sharpen into something he could no longer dismiss, because Emily Carter was still there, still moving through the same town, still living what appeared to be a modest life. But there were small things that did not belong to that image, things that did not make sense, like the black sedan he noticed one morning parked across from the bookstore on Maple, its polished surface catching the early light, its presence too deliberate to be accidental, and at first he told himself it meant nothing, just another car on another street, but then he saw it again the next day, and the day after that, always there for a few minutes before Emily stepped out, always leaving the moment she disappeared inside, as if it had served its purpose simply by delivering her. And the thought lingered in his mind longer than it should have, because it did not align with the life he had assigned to her, and that irritation, that quiet disruption of expectation, followed him into places he usually controlled with ease, into meetings where his attention slipped for just a second too long, into conversations where he found himself distracted by the memory of her steady gaze, and it annoyed him, the way something so insignificant could pull at his focus, until one afternoon, unable to ignore it any longer, he found himself walking down Maple Street under the pretense of grabbing coffee, though he knew exactly where he was going, the bell above the bookstore door chiming softly as he stepped inside, the scent of paper and wood wrapping around him in a way that felt strangely grounding, and there she was behind the counter, speaking to a customer with a quiet confidence that did not need to be performed, her voice calm, her movements efficient, and for a moment, he simply watched unnoticed as she handed over a book, her fingers brushing the cover with a familiarity that spoke of ownership, not just of the space, but of herself. And when she finally looked up and saw him, there was no surprise, no tension, just a brief acknowledgement before she returned to her task, as if his presence did not hold the weight it once had, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because Daniel Brooks had always been certain of his place in her world, had always believed that no matter how far she went, some part of her would remain tied to him. But standing there, in that quiet bookstore, watching a woman who no longer seemed to orbit around him, he felt something shift in a way he could not control, a subtle fracture in the certainty he had carried for so long, and as he turned to leave, the bell chiming again behind him, one thought lingered, persistent and unwelcome, that perhaps Emily Carter had not been waiting at all, perhaps she had been moving forward in ways he had never thought to imagine. By the end of that week, Daniel Brooks told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just a series of small, meaningless details his mind had chosen to exaggerate, but the certainty he once carried so effortlessly had begun to thin at the edges, and he felt it most in the quiet moments, the ones without distraction, where the memory of Emily Carter did not come back as the woman he had left, but as the woman who had looked straight through him without needing anything in return, and it unsettled him in a way he could not quite name, because it forced him to confront something he had never considered, that perhaps he had not been the center of her story for a very long time, and that realization lingered as an irritation he could not shake, following him into the following Saturday evening when he arrived at the Whitmore Foundation Gala, a place where everything made sense. Again, where polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers reflected a world he understood, a world of status, perception, and carefully curated success, and as he adjusted his cufflinks beneath the golden glow of the ballroom lights, he felt himself settling back into that familiar rhythm, the quiet hum of conversation, the soft clink of champagne glasses, the subtle competition woven into every glance and every smile. This was his environment, a place where he knew exactly who he was and how he was seen, and standing beside him was Claire, poised and radiant, her presence a deliberate statement, a continuation of the narrative he had crafted for himself since the divorce, one where everything had improved, where everything had upgraded, and for a while it worked. The conversations flowed, the compliments came easily, and the earlier unease began to fade into something distant and insignificant, until the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the shift was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle pause in movement, a slight change in the direction of attention, the kind of shift that happens before people even realize they are reacting, and then the silence followed, soft but undeniable, rippling through the room as heads turned, and Daniel felt it before he saw it, that same quiet disruption that had followed him all week, only now it was louder, impossible to ignore, and when he finally looked, the world he understood tilted just enough to break. Because Emily Carter stood at the entrance, but not as the woman he had assigned her to be, not as the quiet figure in a simple dress walking into a familiar space. She stood there composed and unmistakably present, her gown catching the light in a way that drew the eye without demanding it, deep emerald silk falling in clean, effortless lines, her posture relaxed yet assured, and, for a moment, Daniel could not reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had carried for so long, because this version of her did not fit anywhere in the story he had written, and as she stepped forward, the room seemed to adjust around her, conversations lowering, attention shifting, as if the space itself recognized something he had failed to see, and then he noticed the man beside her, tall, composed, his presence quiet but commanding in a way that did not need to be announced, and there was something about the way he walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, but in perfect alignment, that made Daniel's chest tighten in a way he could not ignore, because it spoke of something unfamiliar, something he had never given her, and as they moved deeper into the room, a voice nearby murmured a name that carried weight even in a place like this, Alexander Hayes, and the recognition hit Daniel a second too late, the pieces connecting in a way that made everything from the past week suddenly make sense. The car, the composure, the absence of hesitation. It was never about survival, it was never about rebuilding from nothing, it was something else entirely, something far beyond what he had imagined, and as Alexander paused to greet a group of investors, his hand resting lightly at the small of Emily's back, not possessive, not performative but natural, effortless, Daniel felt the final fracture in his certainty give way, because in that moment, watching her stand in a world he believed she could never enter without him, he understood something too late, that she had not been waiting, she had not been broken, she had simply been becoming someone he no longer recognized, and someone he would never again be a part of. Daniel did not move at first, not because he could not, but because something in him refused to accept what he was seeing, as if staying still might somehow return the room to the version he understood. But the longer he watched Emily Carter move through the ballroom, the more undeniable it became that this was not a moment he could reinterpret or dismiss. This was a reality unfolding in front of him with a quiet authority that required no explanation, and it unsettled him in a way that went deeper than surprise, because it was not just her appearance, not just the elegance of the emerald silk or the way the light followed her as she walked, it was the way people responded to her, the subtle shift in posture, the way conversations paused just slightly longer than usual, the kind of attention that was not given freely in rooms like this, and certainly not to someone he had once believed was invisible without him, and yet here she was, not asking for recognition, not seeking it, simply existing within it as if it had always belonged to her, and that was the part he could not reconcile, because it suggested something far more unsettling than a sudden change. It suggested that he had never truly seen her at all, and as that thought settled in, slow and unwelcome, he found himself stepping forward almost without realizing it, drawn by a need to close the distance, to regain some sense of control over a situation that was slipping further from his grasp with every passing second. Claire said something beside him, her voice light and questioning, but he barely registered it, his focus fixed on Emily as she paused near a small circle of guests, Alexander Hayes beside her, speaking in that calm, measured way of his that carried weight without effort. And then it happened, subtle but unmistakable. Someone in the group turned toward Emily and addressed her directly, not as an accessory, not as an introduction, but as the point of interest, their tone respectful, engaged, as if her presence held its own gravity, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest again, sharper this time, because this was not performance, this was not proximity to power, this was recognition, and it forced him to confront a possibility he had been resisting since the moment she walked in. That whatever had changed, it was not recent, it was not accidental, it was the result of something he had not been part of, something that had happened quietly while he was busy rewriting his own story. And as he moved closer, the polished floor reflecting each step beneath him, he became aware of the way the room seemed to narrow, the conversations fading into a low murmur as his focus sharpened, until he was close enough to hear her voice again, calm and steady, answering a question about an upcoming investment initiative. Her words precise, confident, carrying a clarity that did not seek approval, and for a moment, he simply stood there at the edge of the group, listening, the realization settling in piece by piece that this was not a role she had stepped into, this was who she had become, and when Alexander turned slightly, his gaze meeting Daniel's with a brief, assessing glance before shifting back to Emily, there was no challenge in it, no need to assert dominance, only a quiet acknowledgement that made Daniel feel, for the first time in a long time, like the one standing outside the frame. And as the conversation continued without him, flowing naturally, effortlessly, he understood something with a clarity that left no room for denial, that the life he had believed she lost had not defined her. It had only been the beginning of something he had never taken the time to understand, and now, standing there in a room where everything was measured by perception and value, he was forced to confront the simplest and most unsettling truth of all, that Emily Carter had not just moved on, she had moved beyond him entirely, and there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do, to place himself back into a story that no longer needed him. Claire was still speaking when Daniel finally stepped forward, her voice trailing off as she noticed the shift in his attention, the subtle pull that had already taken hold of the room, and though she followed a half step behind, it was clear that whatever balance had existed between them just moments ago had already begun to tilt, because Daniel was no longer performing for the room, he was reacting to it, to her, to Emily Carter standing at the center of a conversation that did not include him, and as he approached, the last fragments of his certainty continued to slip, replaced by something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to realization, because with every step, the details became clearer, the quiet precision of her voice, the way she held herself with a confidence that did not need to be announced, the way others listened not out of obligation but genuine interest, and it forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding since the moment she walked in, that whatever he had once believed about her had been incomplete at best and entirely wrong at worst, and when the small circle of guests finally widened just enough to acknowledge his presence, the moment stretched, suspended between past and present, between what had been and what now was, and Emily turned to him, her expression composed, her gaze steady in a way that did not invite or reject, it simply observed, and for the first time, Daniel found himself without the easy words he had always relied on, without the subtle dominance he had once carried so effortlessly, because none of it seemed to fit here, not in this space where she stood not as someone defined by him, but as someone entirely separate, entirely whole, and Claire offered a polite smile, stepping slightly forward as if to re-establish a familiar dynamic, but even that gesture felt out of place, as if it belonged to a different scene altogether, one that no longer applied, and then Alexander Hayes shifted beside Emily, his presence quiet yet undeniable, his attention moving from the group to Daniel with a calm awareness that required no introduction, as if he already understood more than Daniel was ready to admit, and when he spoke, his tone was measured, respectful, but carrying a weight that made the surrounding conversation fall still for just a moment longer. "I believe we have not met," he said, extending a hand, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, the firm, unhurried handshake grounding the moment in a reality he could no longer avoid. "Daniel Brooks," he replied, his voice steady but lacking the certainty it once held, and Alexander nodded once, as if placing the name into a context Daniel could not see, before turning slightly, his gaze softening in a way that was almost imperceptible as it rested on Emily, and then without spectacle, without the need for emphasis, he spoke again, "This is my wife," and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet finality that did not require repetition, did not require explanation, because the impact was immediate and undeniable, not in volume but in meaning, and Daniel felt it as something internal, something that shifted the last remaining piece of the narrative he had been holding on to, because in that moment every assumption he had carried about her, about himself, about the past, unraveled without resistance, replaced by a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation, and as the conversation resumed around them, as voices returned and the rhythm of the gala continued, Daniel stood there for a second longer than necessary, the weight of realization settling fully into place, because Emily Carter did not look at him with anger or triumph or even indifference. She simply looked at him as someone who had once been part of her life and was no longer relevant to it, and that quiet absence of significance was more definitive than anything he had ever imagined, because it meant that the story he believed he had ended had continued without him, had evolved into something he could not claim, could not influence, and could not return to, and as he finally stepped back, the distance between them widening not just physically but entirely, he understood with a stillness that replaced every previous assumption, that she had not needed to prove anything. She had not needed to come back or show him what he had lost. She had simply lived her life until it no longer intersected with his at all, and in that realization there was no dramatic collapse, no visible defeat, only a quiet, irreversible shift, The kind that happens when the truth does not arrive with noise, but with certainty and leaves nothing behind to question.